Hello, I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver. We're pleased at BIV to present this series of podcasts this week on the future of education. The classroom for all ages, for students and instructors, is going to be much different in the pandemic. And our guests this week are going to discuss how it will be so. We thank the British Columbia Institute of Technology, BCIT, for its support of this series. And now to the conversation.
Hey, welcome to BIV Today, the daily business news show from Business in Vancouver newspaper and BIV.com. I am BIV reporter Tyler Orton, and this week we are focused on the future of education, be it from reskilling adults to the new reality of K through 12 classrooms. And with us today to offer some insights, it is Teri Mooring. She's president of the BC Teachers Federation. Teri, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here, Tyler.
Well, so we're discussing the future of education all week, and I think there are two different things that we need to consider. What does the future of education look like in the short term, and what do things look like in the long term? And I'm curious, though, we're looking towards September. It's a month away until children are supposed to return to the classroom. We had the education minister, he pushed back that start date by 2 days. What are your thoughts? What are your concerns right now with kind of this return to large, numbers of students going to the classroom?
So I was happy to hear that there was going to be some orientation time in the first week. We're in a pandemic. No one has ever returned to school in a pandemic. And so we have to make sure that, we get it right. So what's going to happen in the first couple of days is there will be time for health and safety orientation and training that is really necessary for the educators. And it also gives school staffs, so administrators, support staff, and teachers, the time to come together, get that training, take a look at the logistics at each school, because that will be very different. With a full return of students, it will be very different from the way it was in June also. And so it's really important that that time is given to getting it right. And then the Thursday and Friday, when students do come back, it'll be important for those school teams to be all training students together, so that everyone understands what is expected. There's going to be really important to clearly communicate with families as well, because the reality is many of our students haven't been back to school since we had to move to emergency remote learning in the spring. And so they're going to see a very big difference. And they're going to see that there's a lot of safety protocols in place that they haven't experienced before. And so it's really important that everyone understands what they are, that they're very carefully taught and adhered to throughout the school year.
It is interesting because the education minister said a few weeks ago that if you look at the larger schools, they may not be able to facilitate cohorts of 60 to 120 students that we're speaking of. So he suggested there might be kind of return to some remote learning in some situations. How did that go when we had that going on last spring? It just, from the teacher's perspective, it's not going to be quite the same, but what's your takeaway from some of the changes that we did have to implement?
So in the spring, we were in an emergency situation. And what ended up happening when students came back to school is about 35 to 40% of students came back to school around the province. And so teachers in reality had the majority of their class still learning remotely. And so they would be teaching 4 days a week and then supporting their students that were learning remotely for the rest of the time. And it's not hard to see that that would not be sustainable. However, that doesn't mean that a hybrid model itself is not sustainable. It just means what we had to do because we were in an emergency situation was not sustainable. And so we're perfectly able to plan for a hybrid system if need be. That is sustainable, where some teachers are dedicated to the online learning and some teachers are dedicated to the in-class learning. That's not really what's planned for September, though it was recognized right from the start that some of the larger high school, and I'm hearing even high schools, and I'm hearing even maybe some of the mid to large high schools are going to have some difficulty implementing the learning groups model or the cohort model. And so the reality is that we'll still probably have some students doing some of their learning, at least in a hybrid way online. And we knew that from the start. The other issue is depending on what happens with the pandemic, we also are entering the school year knowing that there's a possibility that we could move into another stage. We hope that doesn't happen, but if it is, it means that, hybrid learning will happen. And so what the difference, I think, between what happened in June and what should be happening next year is we have the opportunity to plan it in a way that it is sustainable.
What are the challenges, though, that educators are facing, though, when trying to implement something such as this hybrid model?
Well, we saw, there are a number of challenges with that. One is, first of all, making sure that all students have access to technology and to the internet. That we ran into that issue as well. The other thing is that not all students learn well in that way. So what we saw in the spring was a variety of methods used in order to teach students and not just relying on online learning. And so those are some of the challenges. Of course, when you're in a pandemic and it's not a normal situation with online learning, we saw families being really finding it, difficult sometimes to manage this. So, in other words, we have families that also were working from home, perhaps with one computer. And so just being able to dedicate that time and find that time for students to have access to technology was challenging. Teachers also had to really adjust to family schedules. And so, the hours of work became very different than it is when students are normally in school. So teachers did all that, of course, because we care deeply about our students and everyone knew we were in an emergency situation. But again, there are ways to plan it. I know that school districts did lend out a lot of technology to families over the spring, and that certainly helped, but it didn't meet the needs. And we also had families that, were having a lot of challenges with perhaps layoffs or medical issues, due to illness. And so, there was a really strong mental health component too that we were really concerned about in terms of our students and how they were coping during this really difficult time without direct access to counselors. Now, all that's possible. Like, we're able to provide counseling services for students and all the other supports necessary if we do need to go to a hybrid model. It, again, just all takes really careful planning.
Looking down the road, I wish we had a crystal ball about when we can figure out when this pandemic is going to have things, somewhat back to the normal that we all know. But do you think that there is potential for, as we learn about how we kind of have to interact in kind of this new era, it could have long-term impacts? There could be some changes coming down, that will be still in place, 5-10 years down the road.
Absolutely. And so perfect example of that is school cleanliness. So what we saw over the last, couple of decades is we saw education funding declining and schools being dramatically underfunded. Schools are still underfunded. What happened in the past was that there were, districts had to make difficult decisions. And some of those decisions were revolved around, cutting custodial time and really scaling back on school cleaning. And we had a lot of concerns about that. That will no longer be acceptable. Is dedicate some funding to hire additional custodial staff. 30, 40 years ago, there were daytime custodians. It was something that was normal. And that will have to come back. I know that school districts right now are organizing themselves so that they do have daytime custodians, so high-touch surface areas can be regularly cleaned. These are things that we're going to have to be in place. There's other things we're going to have to look at as well, though. We're going to have to look at the reality of maybe this pandemic will at some point subside. But I think we're in a new reality where, there could be more things come up that are health related that impact all of us. And so I think we need to be really looking ahead at school designs, size of classrooms, the number of students in each classroom. Right now, we're concerned about classroom density because we know one of the biggest preventative measures for this protecting yourselves against the virus is physical distancing. and our schools are not set up for physical distancing. And so those are the things that we need to take a look at going forward. Hand washing stations. We have so many classrooms either without sinks or without running water. And so these are the measures that need to be put in place. At one time, schools were designed all to have hot and cold running water and soap dispensers. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case moving forward. We have portables that don't have sinks and don't have access to soap and all that kind of thing. So we have to really take a look at our school facilities and how appropriate they are in terms of living within a pandemic and going forward, just protecting ourselves. I think we'll always, from here on in, I think we'll always be much more aware of the measures that we need to take. Frequent hand washing. I think wearing masks is going to be with us for a long time as well. We've seen that in other countries where it just becomes part of your new normal. So I think there's lots of things we need to consider when we look at schools and school facilities. Ventilation systems. We're right now calling on government to really do an analysis of the ventilation and HVAC systems in schools. We have schools that don't have windows that open, and have old ventilation systems. And so I could go on, but there are a lot of things that we need to take a look at in terms of facilities that our children go to every day and spend a significant amount of their lives in.
What about access to equipment? Because look, it's been a while, I'll admit it, since I was in K to 12 classes, but I always recall teachers would have to share a lot of equipment going on. How is that going to be practical in a situation like this where you have a novel coronavirus that still amid us?
And that's something that really has to be rethought as well. So school manipulatives, when you look at kindergarten classrooms, toys, in June, teachers were able to kind of bundle up groupings of materials for students so they didn't have to share. These are, washing hands before using equipment, washing hands after using equipment. There's some really realities here that mean that, schools are going to have to really change. There's going to have to be more of an investment of school materials, classroom manipulatives, so that students don't have to share with different classes or amongst groups of students. So this is a really big rethinking of how we do things in education, and I don't think it's going to be temporary. Certainly we'll be living in some sort of staged education plan for some time, the majority of next year or the entirety of next year, and perhaps beyond. So, we're at the Federation, we're not looking at this in the short term. We're looking at what needs to be in place and sustainable over the long term, and how can we rethink how we do things. A lot of school buildings have been approved recently. This government has put a big investment in infrastructure, including building new schools and renovating schools. I think we need to put a new eye to how we do that in this new reality.
I get the sense from you, and don't let me put words in your mouth or anything like that, but there is perhaps an opportunity, a silver lining almost, for there to be a large rethink about the way that we approach education in this province.
Well, I think we certainly need to take a look at our facilities, and I do. I think we'll have to really take a look at the priorities that we put in terms of education, and do a big rethink of that. We know how important public education is in our society, and how critical a role it plays in our communities. And so, we've been long advocating for putting the appropriate investment into education that is necessary. And I think this, pandemic has really highlighted how far we've fallen behind in terms of those measures. And, this has happened not in the short term, it's happened in the very long term, where we've had, a lack of priority on education for decades. And so I appreciate that, this government has put some investment, especially for this year coming up, into cleaning. There needs to be more investment into additional teachers, because we are anticipating that the classroom density will have to be reduced. That means hiring new teachers. And I will also say that what another big difference is going to happen next year and into the future is that right now, teachers regularly go to school when they're not feeling great. I've been a teacher for 20 years. I taught grade 7 for 20 years. I can't tell you the number of times that I went to school when I was not feeling very good, because it's quite labor intensive to prepare your classroom for somebody else. When you teach grade 7, that's always a challenge. And also there's the availability of a teacher teaching on call to replace you is also a reality, and it's a problem. And so going into next year, we're going to have a zero tolerance for teachers coming to work ill. That means we're going to be reliant on teachers teaching on call a lot more than we were. And we are already, before this pandemic happened, in an incredible teacher shortage where we don't have enough TTOCs. And some of the smaller communities throughout the province and rural communities throughout the province are heavily reliant on retired teachers to do that work. In a pandemic scenario, I'm anticipating that a lot of those teachers won't be taking the risk to do that work anymore. And so, it's going to be critical that BC also engages in a serious retention and recruitment initiatives, so that we have more teachers available. As I say, it was already an issue before the pandemic struck. It's going to become even more of an issue as we move forward into the new year.
To your fellow teachers, I know you guys have also done surveys as well, but what is the sentiment around the teacher community about kind of plans moving forward, especially in the short term?
So what teachers are very highly concerned about health and safety, of course. That's top of mind. And so they're right now needing to hear all the details that are in place. And we're in a difficult situation where there's planning that's happening right now. When we heard the announcement in July, the surprise was a full return of students. Originally, stage 2 would have seen the return of all students from kindergarten to grade 7, but only a partial return for secondary students. So planning for a full return of students was a whole game changer, because it's a whole different perspective. And then we also learned about the cohort model as well. And so now we're sort of taking the cohort model, which was developed by the medical community, and translating it to an education setting. And so there's a lot of work underway. So there's provincial working groups that the ministry has established. We have 25 teachers on those work groups. They're doing their work in a steering committee. And so they've developed a framework. That framework has gone to school districts, a health and safety framework. And they're continuing to develop materials and resources that school districts will need to do their planning. And school districts have begun to take a look at the changes that they need to implement in order to facilitate a full return of students. This is going to be especially challenging at the secondary school level, where 100% return of students and using a cohort model means that a lot of districts will have to rethink how secondary schools are scheduled. And so they are looking at, in many cases, having to redo scheduling and changing the way that they teach students to a semester system or even a quarterly system. And that means students are taking fewer numbers of courses at any given time, and those courses are completed over a shorter period of time. And that's to kind of manage the reduction of the number of students that have interactions with each other. So you can imagine the logistical challenges of that across 60 school districts in this province. That planning is underway right now. And then at the end of August 26th, school districts will have to have all of their school planning and health and safety planning in place and submit those plans to government. So it's going to be a little bit of time before teachers and families get all the details that they'll need in order to really feel comfortable. What I'm hoping happens along the way is both the province and school districts really clearly communicate with both the education community and with families about what the planning is and what plans have been made, so that people can get a real sense of what it's going to look like even before it's all complete. Because I think that will really help to, calm people down. People are very understandably concerned. Families are concerned, and so are teachers and support staff. So the more information that can be shared clearly, as early as possible, the better. So, that's why I was glad to see yesterday the announcement around the start of school happen, because families and teachers will need some time, but especially families will need time to plan, accordingly. So they needed to have at least this amount of notice.
Terry, I think it's interesting to think that we're discussing this just before, students and teachers are going to be returning. I want to talk to you in about 2 or 3 months, and we'll figure out like how things have been going, because I think things are going to change very swiftly, as we found out so far. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much, Tyler.
That's Teri Mooring. She is president of the BC Teachers Federation. And that's it for the show today. Go to BIV.com for more interviews and more stories there. Until next time.